Rich man laughs at poor widow, then her son, Barron Trump, teaches him a lesson. It was a cold grey afternoon in New York City, the kind of day where the wind cuts through your coat and the sky feels heavy with secrets. On the bustling streets, people hurried past, lost in their own worlds, too busy to notice the woman standing outside the grand entrance of an upscale restaurant. She was dressed modestly, her coat worn at the edges, her hands clutching a small purse as she hesitated, glancing through the glass doors. Inside, the warm glow of chandeliers reflected off polished marble floors, and the sound of clinking glasses and soft laughter floated out, a stark contrast to the life she knew. Emma had never stepped foot in such a place before, but today wasn't about her comfort. She was here for her son, Barron. She had promised him a warm meal, something special after everything they had been through. Life had not been kind to them in recent months. After her husband's sudden passing, the bills had piled up, and every day had become a battle just to keep food on the table. But Emma refused to let despair win. She was a mother, and mothers find a way. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside, immediately feeling out of place. The room was filled with elegantly dressed patrons, the air rich with the scent of expensive wine and gourmet dishes. She approached the maitre d', a young man in a crisp suit, who looked her up and down, his expression unreadable. "Table, for two, please," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet strength. Before the maitre d' could respond, a sharp laugh cut through the air. A man at a nearby table, his suit impeccable, his watch gleaming under the golden light, had clearly overheard her. Richard Kingston, a name that carried weight in business circles, known for his ruthless deals, an even colder heart. He leaned back in his chair, amusement dancing in his eyes as he smirked. "A table for two?" he echoed, his voice dripping with mockery. "Are you sure you're in the right place, ma'am?" Emma stiffened. She wasn't naive. She knew how people like him saw people like her. But before she could respond, he continued, his laughter drawing the attention of others. "Look around." He gestured to the room with exaggerated flair. "This isn't exactly a diner on the corner. Maybe there's a sandwich shop down there. Street more suited to your budget." His friends chuckled, entertained by the spectacle. Emma's cheeks burned, but she stood her ground. "I can pay," she said, lifting her chin slightly. Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "Even if you could, this isn't charity. We have standards here." He waved a dismissive hand. "Take my advice, lady. Know your place." Silence hung in the air. People watched, some with pity, some with discomfort, but no one spoke up. Emma felt the weight of their stares, but just as she was about to turn away, a voice cut through the tension. "Mom?" Barron had entered the restaurant, having been a few steps behind her. He was tall for his age, carrying himself with a quiet confidence that made people take notice. His eyes moved from his mother's face to the man who had insulted her, his expression unreadable, but something in his gaze made Richard pause. "Just for a second, is there a problem here?" Barron's voice was calm, but there was something in the way he asked that made Richard shift in his seat. Richard chuckled, though it sounded forced. "No problem, kid. Just some friendly advice for your mother." Barron's lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced around, noting the way people were watching, but staying silent. Then, he did something that no one expected. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, and then met Richard's gaze again. "Since you're so interested in money," Barron said evenly, "maybe you should check your phone." Richard frowned, confused, but curiosity got the better of him. He pulled his phone from his pocket, unlocking it with a swipe. And then, as he looked at the screen, the color drained from his face. His smirk vanished, replaced by something that almost looked like fear. The restaurant, now silent, watched as Richard's hands tightened around his phone. He looked at Barron, his earlier arrogance slipping away. "How did you—" he started, but his voice faltered. Barron just tilted his head slightly. "Still, think my mom doesn't belong here." The tension in the room was electric. Emma looked at her son, surprised but trusting. Richard, for the first time in a long time, found himself at a loss for words, and just like that, the balance of power had shifted. Richard's fingers tightened around his phone, his face a mixture of confusion and barely concealed panic. The confidence he had just moments ago, so effortless, so untouchable, was slipping fast. His eyes darted back to Barron, searching for an explanation, but the teenager simply stood there, calm and composed. The entire restaurant watched in silence, their curiosity growing with every passing second. Emma shifted uncomfortably, still unsure of what exactly was happening. She had known her son was smart, sharp even, but this was something else. "Barron, what did you do?" she asked softly, more out of concern than anything else. Barron didn't take his eyes off Richard. "I just reminded Mr. Kingston here that money doesn't always put you above everyone else." His voice was steady, measured. He wasn't gloating. He was simply stating a fact. Richard scoffed, forcing a chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "Listen, kid, I don't know what game you're playing, but—" He stopped mid-sentence, glancing at his phone again, his jaw tightening. By now, a few people in the restaurant had pulled out their own phones, whispering amongst themselves. Something was happening, and whatever it was, it had Richard rattled. His friends, the ones who had laughed along with him earlier, were now eyeing him uncertainly, as if they weren't sure whether to stand by him or quietly distance themselves. Barron finally broke the silence. "You should read that email again," he said, his voice carrying just enough weight to make Richard hesitate. Slowly, Richard's grip loosened, his thumb scrolling through the screen as his eyes darted over the words. His shoulders stiffened. He swallowed hard. Whatever he was reading, it wasn't good. Emma watched him, her brows furrowing. "Barron, what is this about?" Barron turned to his mother, his expression softer now. "You know how Mr. Kingston here thinks he's better than everyone else? How he laughs at people who don't fit into his world." He glanced back at Richard, who was still frozen in place. "Well, it turns out he's not as untouchable as he thinks." Richard slammed his phone onto the table, his face a deep shade of red. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he snapped. His voice was low, but the edge of desperation was there. "This is nothing but public record," Barron cut in smoothly. "And now, very public." A murmur rippled through the restaurant. Richard's face twisted in anger, but there was fear behind his eyes. He leaned in, lowering his voice, trying to regain control. "Listen, kid, I don't know who you think you are, but you're messing with the wrong person." Barron didn't flinch. "No, I think you are." Emma watched the exchange, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure what Barron had done, but she had seen enough powerful men squirm to recognize what was happening. Richard Kingston, wealthy, arrogant, untouchable Richard, was cornered. One of Richard's associates, a man in his 50s, with silver hair and a tense expression, leaned over. "Richard," he muttered under his breath, "we should leave. Now." Richard shot him a glare but didn't argue. He grabbed his phone, pushed back his chair and stood, his movements stiff and jerky. "This isn't over," he muttered. His voice was quieter now, meant only for Barron. You think you're smart, but you don't know how this world works. Barron tilted his head slightly. Maybe not, but I know people like you, and I know when they've lost. For the first time that night, Richard had nothing to say. He turned sharply and strode toward the exit, his entourage scrambling after him. The room remained silent as the heavy doors swung shut behind him. Emma exhaled, still trying to process everything. She turned to her son. Barron. What just happened? Barron hesitated for a moment, then gave a small knowing smile. Let's just say Mr. Kingston has a few skeletons in his closet, and now a lot more people know about them. Emma shook her head, part awe, part concern. How did you even? I pay attention, Barron said simply. And people like him always leave a trail. A waiter hesitantly stepped forward. Mom, he said, his voice almost apologetic. Your table is ready. Emma blinked, surprised. For a moment, she had forgotten why they were even there. She looked at Barron, who simply nodded. She smiled at the waiter. Thank you. As they sat down, the restaurant slowly returned to normal, though every now and then, someone would glance in their direction, whispers floating through the air. Emma knew this night had changed something, not just for them, but for everyone who had witnessed it. And somewhere out there, Richard Kingston was realizing that no amount of money could erase what had just happened. Emma and Barron sat at their table, the tension from earlier slowly fading into the background. The warmth of the restaurant, the soft hum of conversation, and the scent of freshly prepared meals filled the air, but Emma still felt the weight of what had just happened. She studied her son, who seemed calm, almost unfazed, as he picked up the menu. You really shook that man, she said quietly, still trying to piece everything together. What did you find on him? Barron set the menu down and looked at her. People like Richard Kingston think they can do whatever they want because they have money and power, but they always leave a trail, he said. He's been involved in some shady deals, illegal business practices, tax fraud, mistreatment of employees. A lot of it was buried under fake companies and loopholes, but I found records that tied it all back to him. So I made sure it got to the right people. Emma's eyes widened. You leaked it. Barron gave a small nod. Not just me. I had help from a few people who've been trying to bring him down for years. All they needed was the right proof. Now, the authorities and the media are all over it. Emma sat back, trying to process it all. Just an hour ago, she had walked into this restaurant feeling small, struggling to hold her head high in a world that constantly reminded her of what she didn't have. And now, the man who had mocked her, who had laughed at her as if she were nothing, was the one who had been brought down. Barron, noticing the look on her face, reached across the table and took her hand. Mom, you don't deserve to be treated like that. No one does. Emma felt a lump form in her throat. She squeezed his hand gently, pride and gratitude washing over her. You're incredible. You know that. Barron shrugged. I just did what was right. As they placed their order, the restaurant buzzed with quiet conversations, people still glancing their way, some with admiration, others with curiosity. Word had already spread about what had happened, and Emma could feel the shift in the air. No longer were they looked at as outsiders. Just as their food arrived, Emma's phone buzzed. She glanced down and saw an unknown number calling. Hesitating for a moment, she answered. Hello? A familiar voice came through the line, low and controlled, but with an undeniable edge of frustration. Enjoy your victory while you can, Richard Kingston said. You have no idea what you've started. Emma's grip on the phone tightened. You brought this on yourself, she said, her voice steady. There was silence on the other end, then a slow exhale. We'll see, Richard muttered before the call ended. Emma set the phone down and met Barron's gaze. He had heard enough to know who it was. "He's not going to let this go," she said quietly. Barron took a bite of his food, unfazed. He doesn't have a choice. By tomorrow, his name will be all over the news. He won't be thinking about us. He'll be too busy trying to save himself. Emma exhaled, letting the weight of those words settle in. He was right. Richard Kingston was no longer the untouchable man he had once been. His power, his arrogance, it had all crumbled the moment he was exposed. As they finished their meal, the world outside continued as it always had, the city lights glowing against the night sky, the streets alive with movement. But for Emma, something had changed. She no longer felt invisible. She no longer felt like someone who had to shrink herself to fit into places where she wasn't welcomed. Walking out of the restaurant, Barron slipped his hands into his pockets, glancing at his mother with a small smile. "Let's go home," Emma smiled back, the cold air brushing against her face. "Yeah," she said, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. "Let's go home." And with that, they stepped into the night, leaving behind not just the restaurant, but the weight of a world that had once tried to keep them down.